A smile can hide a very sharp secret. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The late summer evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with the particular contentment that comes after a successful village fete. The bunting still hung between the ancient yews in the vicarage garden, though it sagged now with the weight of evening dew, and the trestle tables bore the pleasant debris of a day well spent. Crumbs from Mrs. Hartwell's prize-winning Victoria sponge, rings left by countless teacups, and the odd forgotten glove or handkerchief that would be claimed tomorrow with mild embarrassment. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the old pear tree, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm as she worked on what would become a winter muffler for her great-nephew Raymond. Her sharp blue eyes, however, were not focused on her stitches, but on the gentle chaos that surrounded her. The vicar's wife, Griselda, fluttered about like a cheerful moth, gathering up the remaining raffle tickets with the sort of determined efficiency that suggested she was already planning next year's event. The evening air carried the mingled scents of roses, freshly cut grass, and the lingering sweetness of jam tarts. Inspector Slack had driven over from Much Benham earlier that afternoon to deliver what he called a few sensible words on the prevention of petty theft, a topic that had seemed rather unnecessary, given that the most serious crime in St. Mary Mead in recent memory had been Mrs. Bantry's missing garden gnome, which had turned up 3 days later in her own potting shed. The inspector was a square, solid man with opinions as firmly set as concrete, and he had spent the better part of the afternoon expressing his views on proper security measures while steadfastly refusing the offered tea in favor of coffee, which he declared to be a more serious beverage for serious matters. As the shadows lengthened and the first evening stars appeared, the villagers had gathered to witness the inaugural chiming of the church's newly restored clock. It was to sound midnight for the first time in over 30 years, and the anticipation was palpable. Dr. Haydock, ever practical, had warned that one more cup of anything would be inadvisable for those of delicate constitution, advice that was cheerfully ignored by most of the assembled company. Miss Marple noticed, as she always did, the small human dramas playing out around her. Young Doris from the post office carried a tray with the careful concentration of someone determined to prove her competence. Colonel Hartnell's attention wandered rather obviously toward the attractive barmaid from the Blue Boar. Mrs. Pierce and Mrs. Simcox exchanged the sort of needle-sharp smiles that spoke of old rivalries barely concealed beneath the veneer of Christian charity. Most intriguingly, Lionel Jerrold, the pale, nervous nephew of the formidable Mrs. Jerrold from Old Hall, hovered near the refreshment table with the restless energy of a man wrestling with some internal debate. Inspector Slack stood, somewhat apart from the general merriment, his coffee cup held like a shield against the prevailing atmosphere of village bonhomie. He had been heard to mutter something about too much sugar in everything and bad for the moral fibre. Comments that Miss Marple had received with her characteristic gentle murmur of, "I dare say, though sweetness has been known to preserve more than it corrupts." The church clock began to prepare for its moment of glory, and a hush fell over the assembled villagers. The inspector, perhaps feeling the weight of communal expectation, took a final, decisive sip from his cup. The chimes began, deep, resonant notes that seemed to roll across the village like a benediction. 1, 2, 3. At the fourth chime, a moth struck one of the lanterns, performing a brief, tragic dance in the golden light. 5, 6. Doris startled slightly, her tray rattling against the table. 7, 8. Lionel Jerrold's lips moved silently, as if he were counting along or perhaps praying. 9, 10. Miss Marple found herself remembering, quite irrelevantly, a young woman from her past who had learned too late that some choices cannot be undone. 11. The evening held its breath. 12. Inspector Slack's coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered against the flagstones. For a moment, the sound seemed merely part of the evening's gentle symphony. Sort of small accident that adds a note of human fallibility to any gathering. But then the inspector himself swayed, made a sound that was neither word nor cry, and collapsed onto the vicarage lawn with a finality that transformed the peaceful evening into something altogether more sinister. Dr. Haydock was at his side within moments, his social manner dropping away like a discarded coat to reveal the focused professional beneath. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency, checking pulse and breathing, while the gathered villagers formed an uncertain circle, their festive mood evaporating like morning mist. "Stand back, please," Dr. Haydock commanded quietly. "Give us some air." His examination was brief but thorough, and when he straightened, his face was grave. "I'm afraid Inspector Slack is dead." The words fell into the evening silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through the assembled company. Miss Marple, moving with the unobtrusive efficiency of long practice, had already bent to examine the shattered coffee cup. The delicate china fragments told their own story. This was not one of the vicarage's familiar green-rimmed set, but a white cup from the church hall. More interesting still was the faint, bitter almond scent that lingered in the evening air, almost masked by the sweeter fragrances of the garden but unmistakable to someone who had encountered it before. As the villagers began to react, some with tears, others with the rapid, nervous chatter that follows shock, Miss Marple straightened slowly, her mild blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The overturned cup, the positioning of the body, the expressions on the faces around her, all of it would matter, she knew, in the days to come. For now, she simply stood quietly in the gathering dusk, her knitting forgotten in her lap, and waited for the truth to begin revealing itself in the way it always did, through the small, telling details that others overlooked, and the eternal patterns of human nature that never truly changed, no matter how peaceful the setting or how innocent the occasion might appear. The shock that followed Dr. Haydock's pronouncement moved through the assembled villagers like ripples across still water, each person absorbing the news according to their nature. Griselda recovered first, her practical instincts asserting themselves as she began directing the immediate necessities with the sort of calm efficiency that comes from years of managing parish crises. The vicar hurried toward the house to telephone Much Benham, while Dr. Haydock knelt beside the inspector's still form, his professional manner a steadying influence on the increasingly agitated crowd. Miss Marple remained precisely where she was, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm while her keen blue eyes observed the human drama unfolding around her. She had learned long ago that people revealed their truest selves in moments of crisis, when shock stripped away the careful facades of daily social intercourse. The bitter almond scent still lingered faintly in the evening air, almost masked now by the sweeter fragrances of the garden, but unmistakable to someone who had encountered it before in circumstances far removed from village fates. "Stand back, please," Dr. Haydock said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of professional competence. "Give us room to work." Though his examination was thorough, Miss Marple noticed that his expression grew increasingly troubled as he completed his preliminary assessment. When he straightened, brushing grass from his knees, there was something in his manner that suggested this was no ordinary collapse. Mrs. Pierce, never one to let a dramatic moment pass without commentary, had appointed herself chief interpreter of events. "Well, I never did see the like," she declared to anyone within earshot, her voice carrying that peculiar mixture of shock and satisfaction that comes from being present at significant happenings. Inspector Slack, of all people. Such a robust-looking man, too, though I did notice he seemed rather flushed during his talk this afternoon. Colonel Hartnell, drawing upon his military experience, pronounced with certainty, "Heart attack, most likely. Seen it happen before in India. Men of his build, you know. All that coffee instead of proper tea. Bad for the constitution, I always said." Young Doris, from the post office, stood frozen beside her tray, tears streaming down her face. "He was just standing there," she kept repeating too, Anyone who would listen. Just drinking his coffee like anyone might, and then the cup slipped right from his hands. Her voice caught on a sob. I brought him that cup myself, miss. The white one from the church hall, because all the green ones were taken. Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. The white cup, dear. Not one of the vicarage set. No, miss. We'd run short, you see. And the inspector, he particularly wanted coffee instead of tea. Said it was a more serious drink for serious business. Doris wiped her eyes with her apron. He took sugar himself, from the bowl by the coffee urn. Said he trusted his own hand better than mine. How very particular of him, Miss Marple murmured, her tone suggesting nothing more than mild interest in domestic arrangements. And there were 2 sugar bowls, I noticed. One for the tea and one for the coffee. Yes, miss. Mrs. Clement thought it best to keep them separate, what with the different tastes and all. From the shadows near the church wall, Lionel Jerrold emerged, his pale face drawn and anxious. He approached the group with the hesitant manner of someone who wishes to help but fears to intrude. Terrible business, he said, his voice rather too controlled. One never knows, does one, when such things might happen. Mrs. Jerrold appeared at that moment, her imposing figure cutting through the crowd with the authority of long-established social position. Inspector Slack, she announced without preamble, came to see me this evening before the festivities began. He was laboring under certain misconceptions regarding the church clock restoration fund. Several heads turned at this revelation. The vicar, returning from his telephone call, looked startled. Misconceptions, Mrs. Jerrold. Anonymous letters, she said with magnificent disdain. Some malicious person has been sending unsigned accusations about financial irregularities. The inspector seemed to believe there was substance to these calumnies. I informed him precisely what I thought of such methods. Mr. Clement's face grew troubled. We received such a letter ourselves in the poor box last Sunday. I showed it to Inspector Slack this afternoon, thinking it my duty. Others, Colonel Hartnell barked. Confound the mischief-maker, stirring up scandal for sport. It is not always for sport, Miss Marple observed gently, her fingers resuming their steady work. Sometimes such letters serve other purposes entirely. The sound of a motor car approaching along the village lane brought a temporary halt to speculation. Constable Polk from the local station had arrived, summoned by some helpful soul, though his obvious bewilderment at finding himself in charge of such a situation was apparent to all. He stood uncertainly beside the body, clearly out of his depth while waiting for his superiors from Much Benham. Dr. Haydock approached Miss Marple with the casual manner of an old friend seeking conversation, but his voice was low and serious. Jane, you noticed something about that cup, didn't you? The scent, she replied quietly, not looking up from her knitting. Quite unmistakable, though fading now. I thought so too. We'll need to preserve what's left of the contents, though I suspect there won't be much to analyze. As the evening deepened and the official investigators failed to arrive, the villagers settled into that peculiar waiting period that follows any sudden death. Some gathered in small groups, speaking in the hushed tones that tragedy demands, while others stood alone, lost in private thoughts. The church clock, having performed its long-awaited midnight chime, now seemed to tick with unusual emphasis in the quiet air, marking time until truth could be discovered. Miss Marple tucked her knitting away and prepared herself for what she suspected would be a very long and revealing night. The patterns were already beginning to emerge. The anonymous letters, the carefully separated sugar bowls, the bitter scent that spoke of deliberate intent rather than natural causes. In her experience, murder always followed certain predictable patterns, however cleverly disguised. The challenge lay not in recognizing that a crime had occurred, but in understanding which of the many possible motives had finally driven someone to cross that fatal line between thought and action. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead had been introduced to murder, and nothing would be quite the same again. The arrival of Detective Inspector Craddock from Much Benham brought an immediate sense of professional competence to the increasingly tense situation at the vicarage. Unlike the unfortunate Inspector Slack, Craddock possessed both the experience and temperament necessary for delicate investigations, qualities that became apparent as he surveyed the scene with quiet thoroughness while managing the understandable anxiety of the witnesses. Miss Marple observed with approval as Craddock methodically examined the area. His approach a welcome contrast to Constable Polk's earlier bewilderment. The evening, which had been all bunting and sponge cake, now rearranged itself into evidence and statements with the sort of grim efficiency that transforms peaceful gatherings into crime scenes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Craddock addressed the assembled villagers with calm authority, "I understand this has been shocking for you all. I'll need to speak with each of you individually, but for now, please remain where you are while we examine the immediate area." Dr. Haydock approached the detective with the fragments of the shattered coffee cup carefully wrapped in his handkerchief. "There's a distinct almond odor, Inspector. I've preserved what little liquid remained, though I'm afraid most soaked into the ground." Craddock examined the china pieces with interest, noting their difference from the vicarage's familiar green-rimmed set. Under the doctor's supervision, Griselda produced jars and labels, while young Doris, pale but steady, carefully decanted the contents of the 2 sugar bowls, white cubes for coffee, brown crystals for tea, with silver tongs that had one arm slightly bent, lying between them like a delicate question mark. As Constable Polk examined the area around the refreshment table with more enthusiasm than expertise, he discovered something significant behind the tea urn, a small glass vial, empty but bearing the partially torn label of a pharmaceutical preparation. Craddock accepted the bottle carefully, holding it up to catch the lantern light. Dr. Haydock examined the vial with professional interest, his expression growing increasingly grave. "It's from Jarvis's pharmacy in Much Benham. The label's been deliberately damaged, but I can make out part of what appears to be a cyanide compound, probably potassium cyanide for photographic purposes. Jarvis supplies the local camera club." This revelation sent a visible shock through the assembled group. Photography was a popular hobby in the area, with several villagers known to maintain darkrooms in their homes. The idea that such a common chemical could be turned to murderous purpose was both frightening and oddly reassuring. It suggested the killer was not some mysterious outsider, but someone with access to ordinary materials. Mrs. Jerrold, maintaining her rigid composure, stepped forward with information that would prove crucial. Inspector Slack was laboring under certain delusions this evening. He had received anonymous letters suggesting financial irregularities in our church restoration fund. Malicious nonsense, naturally, but it seemed to have affected his judgment. Anonymous letters? Craddock's interest sharpened considerably. "Were you the only recipient, Mrs. Jerrold?" The vicar cleared his throat uncomfortably. "We found one in the poor box last Sunday. I felt it my duty to show it to Inspector Slack when he arrived this afternoon." Colonel Hartnell admitted with obvious reluctance. "I received one as well. Damned impertinence, suggesting irregularities in the cricket club accounts. Threw the thing in the fire immediately." A murmur ran through the assembled villagers as the extent of the anonymous letter campaign became apparent. Miss Marple noted with interest how this revelation affected different people. Mrs. Pierce looked both scandalized and secretly pleased to witness such drama, while her companion, Mrs. Simcox, maintained the sort of carefully neutral expression that suggested she possessed information she was not yet prepared to share. As the official investigation took shape, the villagers began voicing their own theories, the initial paralysis of shock giving way to a need to understand and rationalize this jarring intrusion into their familiar world. "It must have been his heart," Mrs. Bantry declared with conviction. "All that stress of being an inspector, and he did seem rather portly." Colonel Hartnell, drawing upon his military experience, maintained his earlier diagnosis. "Apoplexy, very common among men of his build. All that coffee instead of proper tea. Bad for the constitution, I always said." Young Lionel Jerrold, who had been standing in the shadows with increasing agitation, suddenly burst out, "It's all wrong, don't you see? Someone's been stirring up trouble deliberately, trying to make people suspicious of each other. The inspector was a good man, just doing his duty." His aunt's sharp glance silenced him immediately, but not before Miss Marple had noted the genuine distress in his voice and the way his reaction suggested more than general sympathy for the deceased. Miss Marple listened to these pronouncements with her characteristic air of mild interest, understanding that people always sought the simplest, most comfortable explanations when confronted with something as unsettling as sudden death. They preferred natural causes and familiar ailments, anything that did not hint at malice or the darker corners of human intention. Her attention focused on the specific details that others overlooked. The deliberate separation of the sugar bowls, Inspector Slack's insistence on serving himself, and the bitter almond scent that spoke of careful preparation rather than spontaneous action. She found herself remembering her nephew Raymond's enthusiasm for photography during his last visit, his detailed explanations of the various chemicals required for developing film, including several compounds that were quite dangerous if mishandled. "The question," she murmured quietly to Dr. Haydock, "is not so much who had access to such materials, but who knew enough about Inspector Slack's habits to predict exactly how he would take his coffee." Craddock, overhearing this observation, nodded thoughtfully. Someone who had observed him carefully, or perhaps someone who had reason to ensure he would be particular about his refreshments this evening. As Craddock began organizing individual interviews and the detective work shifted into a more systematic phase, Miss Marple settled herself on a nearby garden bench. Her knitting provided the perfect cover for careful observation, allowing her to watch the subtle interactions and reactions that would prove more revealing than any formal statement. The killer was almost certainly still among them, maintaining whatever facade had served to conceal their intentions until this moment. Anonymous letters, she knew from experience, were rather like nettles. They appeared where the ground had been disturbed. Someone had been systematically sowing discord in the village, and now that campaign of malice had escalated to murder. The challenge would be identifying which of the many possible motives had finally driven someone to transform anonymous spite into deadly action. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead had been introduced to murder, and Miss Marple suspected that before the truth emerged, many more secrets would be dragged into the light of investigation. The church clock continued its steady ticking, marking time while the patterns of human nature, predictable as always beneath their civilized veneer, began to reveal themselves to those patient enough to watch and wise enough to understand what they were seeing. Detective Inspector Craddock established his investigation with the methodical precision that had earned him respect throughout the county. The vicar's study became his temporary headquarters, its walls lined with theological texts providing an ironic backdrop to the evening's decidedly earthly concerns. Through the partially open door, Miss Marple could observe the careful choreography of official inquiry while appearing to concentrate entirely on her knitting, a position that afforded her invaluable insights into both the investigator's methods and the witnesses' reactions. The interviews began with those who had been closest to the refreshment table during Inspector Slack's final moments. Young Doris emerged first, her face bearing the relieved expression of someone who had discharged a difficult duty honestly. Her account had been clear and detailed. Inspector Slack's insistence on coffee over tea, his preference for serving himself, his methodical addition of exactly 2 sugar cubes from the designated bowl. Most significantly, she confirmed that the inspector had been particular about his habits, trusting his own hand better than mine when it came to preparing his refreshment. When Lionel Jerrold was called for his interview, the young man's distress became immediately apparent to all observers. His hands trembled visibly as he entered the study, and his voice, when it could be heard through the walls, carried a note of barely controlled panic that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances. The interview lasted considerably longer than the others, nearly 20 minutes, and when Lionel finally emerged, his face was ashen and drawn. The revelation that followed struck the assembled villagers like a thunderclap. Constable Polk returned from his telephone call to Jarvis's pharmacy with information that transformed speculation into apparent certainty. A bottle of potassium cyanide had been purchased just 2 days prior, sold on account to Mr. Lionel Jerrold for the Camera Club's legitimate photographic needs. "There's your answer," Colonel Hartnell declared with military satisfaction. "Means, opportunity, and motive all wrapped up neat as you please." The boy had access to the poison. He was hovering about the refreshment table all evening, and if those anonymous letters were threatening his aunt's reputation. The physical evidence continued to accumulate with damning consistency. A thorough search of the church hall revealed not one but 2 empty cyanide vials, one behind the tea urn where it might have been hastily discarded, another more carefully concealed behind a stack of hymn books. The bent silver tongs that Miss Marple had quietly noted were found to bear traces of white powder in their creases, suggesting they had been used to handle the poisoned sugar cubes with deliberate care. The village's reaction followed predictable patterns of human nature when presented with a convenient solution to disturbing events. Mrs. Pierce appointed herself chief interpreter of the evidence, declaring to anyone within earshot that she had always sensed something not quite right about that young man. The general consensus, fueled by relief at having a clear culprit identified, was that Lionel's guilt was beyond reasonable doubt. Even Mrs. Jerrold's fierce defense of her nephew seemed only to confirm suspicions. Her imperious denials and threats of legal action were interpreted not as protective loyalty, but as the desperate machinations of a woman trying to shield a guilty relative from justice. When she demanded that Lionel be allowed proper legal representation before answering further questions, the villagers saw confirmation rather than prudent caution. Craddock himself appeared increasingly confident in his case. The evidence formed a compelling narrative. A nervous young man with access to deadly chemicals, motivated by threats to his family's reputation, had seized the opportunity provided by Inspector Slack's predictable habits to eliminate a dangerous investigator. The anonymous letters provided context, the pharmacy records established means, and the physical evidence suggested careful premeditation rather than impulsive action. Yet Miss Marple, observing these developments with her characteristic quiet attention, found herself troubled by aspects of the case that others seemed eager to overlook. The evidence against Lionel was almost too perfect, too neatly arranged to satisfy every requirement of guilt. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that real crimes rarely presented themselves with such convenient clarity. The psychological profile troubled her most. Lionel Jerrold possessed the temperament of a man who would agonize over stepping on an ant, let alone committing deliberate murder. His obvious distress seemed genuine rather than calculated, the reaction of someone horrified to find himself suspected rather than someone struggling to conceal guilt. The bent tongs, the carefully positioned vials, even the timing of the poison's administration, all suggested a mind capable of cold calculation that seemed fundamentally at odds with Lionel's nervous, artistic nature. Moreover, the anonymous letters that had supposedly provided motive struck her as the work of someone far more systematic and malicious than the anxious young man now under suspicion. Such campaigns of deliberate character assassination required patience and cunning that seemed beyond Lionel's emotional capacity. As the evening progressed and official opinion solidified around Lionel's guilt, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations. The real killer, she suspected, was still among them, watching with satisfaction as the investigation focused on such a convenient scapegoat. The truth, as always, lay not in the obvious evidence but in the subtle patterns of human behavior that revealed themselves to those patient enough to watch and wise enough to understand what they were truly seeing. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead was learning that justice and convenience were not always synonymous, and that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared least capable of evil. The official proceedings continued with methodical precision as Detective Inspector Craddock completed his preliminary interviews. but Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the refreshment table where the evening's tragedy had unfolded. The physical evidence told one story, yet something in its very completeness troubled her deeply. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that real crimes rarely presented themselves with such convenient clarity. The lanterns cast pools of golden light across the remnants of the evening's festivities, and in that gentle illumination, Miss Marple began to notice details that had been overlooked in the initial shock and confusion. Her attention settled on the silver tongs that lay between the two sugar bowls. The implement that Constable Polk had triumphantly identified as bearing traces of white powder in its creases. Moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood the importance of observation, Miss Marple lifted the tongs delicately, turning them to catch the lantern light. One arm bore a slight inward bend at the hinge, so subtle as to be nearly invisible unless one looked specifically for it. More telling was the maker's mark on the inner curve, a small cartouche with a crown and a worn initial that she recognized from recent parish gatherings. "Griselda, my dear," she said softly as the vicar's wife approached with a tray for collecting the remaining implements. "These are not your usual tongs, I believe." Griselda paused, examining the silver pieces with the sort of practical attention that came from years of managing parish equipment. "No, indeed, Miss Marple. Our regular ones have a small dent from an unfortunate incident involving the vicar and a chair. Quite another story entirely. These are much finer. I believe Doris mentioned that our usual tongs had gone missing during the evening, and Mrs. Simcox very kindly offered to fetch her own set from home." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm as she absorbed this information. "How thoughtful of Mrs. Simcox. I don't suppose you recall when this exchange took place." "Oh, it was quite near the end of the evening," Griselda replied, her brow creasing with the effort of recollection. "There had been some confusion with the serving arrangements. People were becoming rather particular about the sugar service. You know how it is at these affairs. Mrs. Simcox noticed the difficulty and offered to solve it by bringing her own tongs. She returned just as the clock was preparing for its midnight chime." This revelation struck Miss Marple as profoundly significant, though she maintained her characteristic expression of mild interest. The timing suggested that Mrs. Simcox had been absent from the immediate vicinity during the crucial moments when the poison must have been administered to the sugar bowl. Yet her return with the replacement tongs had occurred at precisely the moment when Inspector Slack was preparing to serve himself his fatal refreshment. "And the original tongs?" Miss Marple inquired with gentle curiosity. "Were they ever recovered?" "Oh yes, eventually. Doris found them in her apron pocket this morning. She'd quite forgotten putting them there during the earlier confusion with the napkins. You know how these things happen at busy gatherings." Miss Marple did indeed know, but she also understood that such convenient explanations often masked more deliberate arrangements. The bent condition of Mrs. Simcox's tongs suggested they had been subjected to unusual stress, and the white powder residue indicated they had been used for purposes beyond their normal function of serving sugar to tea drinkers. As she continued her quiet observations, Miss Marple reflected on the psychological profile emerging from the evening's events. The evidence against Lionel Jerrold was almost too perfect in its completeness. The pharmacy records, the empty vials, even the young man's obvious distress all combined to create an irresistibly convincing narrative of guilt. Yet in her experience, real murderers rarely left such comprehensive trails of evidence unless they possessed either remarkable stupidity or extraordinary confidence in their ability to misdirect suspicion. The anonymous letters provided another piece of the puzzle. Such campaigns of systematic character assassination required patience, observation, and a deep understanding of village social dynamics. They were typically the work of someone who appeared respectable and trustworthy, someone whose position in the community provided both access to information and protection from suspicion. Mrs. Simcox possessed all these characteristics. As a regular volunteer at parish functions, she had ample opportunity to observe the habits and preferences of her fellow villagers. Her reputation for efficiency and helpfulness made her presence at any gathering both expected and welcomed. Most significantly, her timely provision of replacement tongs had positioned her as a helpful participant rather than a suspicious presence during the crucial moments of the crime. Miss Marple began to reconstruct the evening's events with the methodical precision that had served her well in previous investigations. Mrs. Simcox had likely prepared the poisoned sugar cubes in advance, using her knowledge of Inspector Slack's particular habits regarding his coffee service. The temporary removal of the original tongs had created the perfect opportunity to introduce her own implements, bent slightly to ensure they would naturally select cubes from a specific position in the bowl. When she returned with the replacement tongs, ostensibly as a helpful solution to a serving problem, she had been able to position the poison cubes precisely where Inspector Slack's predictable habits would lead him to select them. The bent tongs ensured that anyone using them would naturally grasp from the near right corner of the sugar bowl, exactly where a careful poisoner would place her deadly preparation. The timing had been perfect. Mrs. Simcox's brief absence provided her with an alibi for the actual moment of poison placement, while her helpful return with the tongs established her as a concerned participant rather than a suspicious actor. The subsequent discovery of the bent tongs with their incriminating residue would appear to implicate whoever had last used them, which the evidence suggested was Lionel Jerrold during his nervous hovering near the refreshment table. As Detective Inspector Craddock completed his arrangements for transporting Lionel to Much Benham for further questioning, Miss Marple made her decision. The young man's obvious innocence demanded intervention, but direct accusation without conclusive proof would only alert the real killer to the danger of discovery. Instead, she would employ the subtle psychological pressure that had served her well in previous cases, the gentle application of knowledge that would force the guilty party to reveal themselves through their own actions. "Inspector Craddock," she said quietly as he passed near her position, "I wonder if you might consider examining Mrs. Simcox's tongs more carefully. There may be more to discover about their recent use than initially apparent." The detective paused, his attention sharpening at her tone. "You've noticed something specific, Miss Marple. Only that helpful people sometimes reveal more through their assistance than through their words," she replied with characteristic understatement. "And that timing, in matters of murder, is often more significant than motive or opportunity alone." As the evening progressed toward its official conclusion, Miss Marple settled herself to observe the final act of the drama she had begun to understand. The killer was still among them, maintaining their facade of concerned citizenship while secretly celebrating the apparent success of their elaborate deception. But patterns of behavior, once established, were difficult to change, and she suspected that their need to control the investigation's direction would ultimately provide the key to their exposure. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead was about to learn that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful, and that true justice required looking beyond the obvious evidence to the subtle patterns of human nature that revealed themselves to those patient enough to watch and wise enough to understand what they were truly seeing. Detective Inspector Craddock possessed the sort of methodical mind that valued thorough investigation over convenient conclusions, a quality that had served him well throughout his career and would prove invaluable in the present circumstances. Miss Marple's gentle suggestion regarding Mrs. Simcox's tongs resonated with his growing unease about the almost too-perfect case against Lionel Jerrold. While the evidence against the young man remained compelling, something in its very completeness troubled him. Real crimes, in his experience, rarely presented themselves with such convenient clarity. Under the focused beam of his electric torch, the silver tongs revealed details that had been invisible in the garden's gentle lantern glow. The bent arm showed signs of recent stress rather than gradual wear, and more significantly, traces of crystalline residue clung to the inner surfaces. Residue that bore the unmistakable bitter almond scent Dr. Haydock had identified earlier. the maker's mark, a small cartouche with a crown and worn initial, confirmed these were indeed quality pieces from an established household, not the standard vicarage implements. Constable Park's return from his telephone inquiry to Jarvis's pharmacy brought revelations that shifted the investigation's focus dramatically. While the cyanide purchase remained charged to Mr. Lionel Jerrold's Camera Club account, the actual collector had been described as a lady, middle height, Vial, who had signed the receipt with a looping initial that could be interpreted as either L or S. This detail, overlooked in the initial rush to establish Lionel's guilt, now cast the entire transaction in a different light. Even more significantly, Polk reported that Inspector Slack's leather notebook, the one he carried as faithfully as his professional skepticism, was nowhere to be found among his effects. The implications of this discovery sent a subtle chill through the assembled villagers, for everyone knew that Inspector Slack recorded everything in that book, from official observations to personal suspicions about ongoing investigations. Mrs. Simcox, who had been maintaining her characteristic air of helpful concern throughout the evening's proceedings, found herself the subject of increasingly pointed attention. Her reaction to Craddock's examination of the tongs was telling, a carefully calibrated expression of puzzled innocence that emphasized the implement's respectable provenance while subtly deflecting suspicion. "How very strange, Inspector," she said, stepping forward with practiced concern. "I cannot imagine how such a thing could have occurred. These tongs have been in my family for generations. They were my grandmother's wedding silver." The mention of family heritage was particularly clever, implying that such implements would never be associated with anything as sordid as murder. Yet Miss Marple, observing from her position near the refreshment table, noticed the subtle signs of strain beginning to appear in Mrs. Simcox's composure. Her hands, which had been steady throughout the evening's chaos, now showed a barely perceptible tremor. Her responses, while still appropriately concerned, carried a note of defensive precision that suggested careful preparation rather than spontaneous reaction. The systematic nature of the anonymous letter campaign became increasingly apparent as more villagers admitted to receiving similar correspondence. Mrs. Pierce, never one to be excluded from dramatic revelations, announced that she too had received such a letter containing the most dreadful allegations about the Women's Institute accounts. The vicar produced his letter from the poor box, noting the distinctive cream-colored paper with its subtle watermark. Most revealing was Mrs. Pierce's inadvertent disclosure that Mrs. Simcox herself had received an anonymous letter regarding the flower rota arrangements. Mrs. Simcox's vehement denial, "That was a trifling matter, Mrs. Pierce, hardly worth mentioning," struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. The letters were not just targeting high-profile figures, but were systematically undermining the village's social fabric at every level. As the investigation progressed, fragments of village history began to surface that cast Mrs. Simcox's involvement in a more sinister light. Miss Marple recalled the woman's oddly intense opposition to Inspector Slack's proposal for increased police patrols during a recent village council meeting, her argument that such measures constituted an unnecessary intrusion into our peaceful lives, seeming disproportionate to the minor nature of the issue. More significantly, the village's collective memory began to recall Mrs. Simcox's past engagement to a young man who had left St. Mary Mead years ago under a cloud of unspoken scandal. He had been suspected, though never formally charged, of embezzling funds from the local horticultural society, a society Mrs. Simcox had tirelessly supported. The possibility that Inspector Slack had been investigating old cases, perhaps following new information that threatened to expose long-buried secrets, began to seem increasingly plausible. Dr. Haydock's professional assessment of the poison's effects confirmed that the crime required detailed knowledge of both chemistry and timing. "This was not a crime of passion," he observed quietly to Miss Marple. "The preparation required careful planning and precise execution, qualities that suggest someone with both patience and detailed knowledge of the victim's habits." Miss Marple found herself remembering her nephew Raymond's enthusiasm for photography during his last visit, his detailed explanations of the various chemicals required for developing film. Mrs. Simcox, she recalled, had been present during several parish gatherings where Inspector Slack had demonstrated his particular habits regarding coffee service, his methodical approach to self-service, his precise addition of exactly 2 sugar cubes, and his predictable selection pattern that always favored the near right corner of the serving bowl. The psychological profile emerging from the evening's revelations troubled Miss Marple deeply. Mrs. Simcox represented a type she had encountered before, the helpful, efficient woman whose need for control and recognition gradually transformed into something darker and more dangerous. The anonymous letters had been her first weapon, designed to create chaos, while positioning herself as a voice of reason and stability. When Inspector Slack's investigation threatened to expose her activities, murder had become the logical next step in her campaign of manipulation. As Craddock prepared to expand his investigation beyond the immediate scene, the psychological pressure on Mrs. Simcox became increasingly apparent. Her offers to examine the anonymous letters for similarities were politely declined, as the detective had already noticed that her handwriting samples from parish records bore certain characteristics that warranted further analysis. The discovery that the cream-colored paper used for the letters matched stationery found in her home desk was explained as coincidence, but her explanation lacked the spontaneous indignation that would characterize genuine innocence. Such a campaign of malicious correspondence, Mrs. Simcox observed with apparent disapproval, suggests someone with far too much time on their hands and insufficient Christian charity in their heart. Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing, expressing appropriate moral outrage while avoiding specific details that might betray personal knowledge of the letter's contents or origins. The evening progressed with the steady accumulation of circumstantial evidence, each piece adding weight to the case against Mrs. Simcox, while simultaneously revealing the elaborate nature of her deception. The bent tongs, the missing notebook, the veiled figure at the pharmacy, the systematic letter campaign, all pointed to a mind capable of meticulous planning and ruthless execution. As the church clock continued its steady ticking, marking time while the investigation moved toward its inevitable conclusion, Miss Marple reflected on the patterns of human nature that never truly changed, regardless of how peaceful the setting or how respectable the facade. The village of St. Mary Mead was learning that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful, and that the mask of Christian charity could conceal depths of malice that would shock those who had never looked beyond surface appearances to understand the darker truths that lay beneath. The psychological pressure that had been building around Mrs. Simcox reached a crucial juncture as Detective Inspector Craddock's methodical questioning began to reveal the sophisticated nature of the deception they were confronting. Her carefully maintained facade of helpful concern showed increasing signs of strain, yet rather than crumbling under scrutiny, she seemed to be calculating her next move with the cold precision that had characterized her entire campaign of malice. The turning point came when young Doris, who had been quietly collecting the remaining fête decorations in an effort to restore some normalcy to the evening, made a discovery that would dramatically shift the investigation's focus. Near the old well at the far edge of the vicarage garden, partially concealed beneath a tangle of ivy that had clearly been recently disturbed, she found Inspector Slack's missing leather notebook. "Inspector Craddock," she called, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "I found something important." The notebook was damp with evening dew but otherwise intact, its familiar brown leather binding immediately recognizable to all who had known Inspector Slack's meticulous habits. Craddock examined the recovered notebook with the careful attention it deserved, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he reviewed its contents. The entries revealed Inspector Slack's systematic investigation into the anonymous letter campaign, complete with detailed observations about handwriting analysis, paper sources, and delivery methods. Most significantly, the final entries, dated that very afternoon, contained observations that cast the evening's events in an entirely different light. The crucial passages, written in Inspector Slack's unmistakable blocky handwriting, outlined a growing suspicion of Lionel Jerrold that seemed to provide the missing motive for murder. The entries detailed Lionel's access to photographic chemicals, his nervous behavior during questioning, and most damning of all, observations about financial irregularities in the church restoration fund that Lionel had helped to manage. One entry read, "Young Jerrold's agitation when discussing fund management suggests personal involvement. His reaction to direct questioning about the anonymous accusations was telling. Genuine fear rather than innocent bewilderment." Another noted, "The Camera Club's chemical purchases correspond precisely with the timeline of the letter campaign. Coincidence seems increasingly unlikely." The final entry, apparently written just hours before Inspector Slack's death, was particularly chilling. "Confrontation planned for this evening. Jerrold's desperate state suggests he may attempt something drastic if cornered. Must proceed with extreme caution." The notebook's discovery sent a wave of shocked recognition through the assembled villagers. Colonel Hartnell declared with military certainty, "There's your proof, Inspector. The boy knew Slack was closing in, and he took desperate measures to silence him." Mrs. Pierce, never one to miss a dramatic moment, announced that she had always sensed something troubled about young Lionel, though one hesitates to speak ill of the distressed. Even Mrs. Jerrold's fierce defense of her nephew seemed to confirm, rather than dispel, suspicions. Her imperious denials and threats of legal action were interpreted as the desperate machinations of a woman attempting to protect a guilty relative from inevitable justice. When she demanded that Lionel be provided with proper legal representation, the villagers saw confirmation of guilt rather than prudent caution. Yet Miss Marple, observing these developments from her position near the refreshment table, found herself deeply troubled by the notebook's convenient discovery and its almost too perfect contents. In her long experience with criminal minds, she had learned that real evidence rarely presented itself with such dramatic timing and comprehensive clarity. The location of the discovery, near the old well, far from where Inspector Slack had spent his final moments, suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. More troubling still was the psychological profile emerging from the notebook's entries. The systematic, calculating mind revealed in Inspector Slack's observations seemed fundamentally at odds with Lionel Jerrold's anxious, artistic temperament. The young man possessed neither the emotional coldness nor the strategic thinking necessary for such elaborate deception and premeditated murder. As Craddock prepared to arrest Lionel based on this apparently conclusive evidence, Miss Marple recognized the notebook's discovery for what it truly was. The killer's most audacious gambit yet. Mrs. Simcox had not merely committed murder and attempted to frame an innocent man. She had actively manipulated the investigation itself, creating evidence that would redirect suspicion away from herself and toward her chosen scapegoat. The sophistication of this deception revealed a criminal mind of exceptional cunning and ruthlessness. Mrs. Simcox had not only anticipated the discovery of her initial crime, but had prepared a secondary layer of misdirection designed to exploit the very thoroughness of the investigation against itself. The notebook represented more than evidence. It was a psychological weapon designed to convince even experienced investigators that they had found their killer. As the official investigation prepared to conclude with Lionel's arrest, Miss Marple understood that she was witnessing the near-perfect execution of a criminal plan that had been months in the making. The anonymous letters had been merely the opening gambit in a campaign of manipulation that had culminated in murder and the systematic destruction of an innocent young man's reputation and future. The challenge now was not simply identifying the true killer. Miss Marple was increasingly certain of Mrs. Simcox's guilt, but proving it in the face of evidence that had been carefully crafted to support an alternative narrative. The woman's need for control, which had driven her to murder rather than accept exposure, had manifested in this final, desperate attempt to manipulate justice itself. The church clock continued its steady ticking, marking time while the investigation moved toward what appeared to be its logical conclusion, though Miss Marple suspected that the most crucial revelations were yet to come. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead was about to learn that the most dangerous criminals were not those who acted in passion or desperation, but those who possessed the patience and cunning to transform the very instruments of justice into weapons for their own protection. The evening's final act was about to begin, and Miss Marple prepared herself for the delicate task of exposing a deception so sophisticated that it had nearly convinced even her of an innocent man's guilt. Detective Inspector Craddock had just reached for his handcuffs when Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the evening air with the quiet authority that comes from absolute certainty. "Inspector, if you would indulge an old woman's fancy for just a moment, I believe a small demonstration might prevent a very grave mistake." The detective paused, his hand hovering over the arrest warrant, while the assembled villagers turned toward Miss Marple with the mixture of curiosity and impatience that follows any interruption of seemingly inevitable justice. Lionel Jerrold stood pale and trembling beside Constable Polk, his fate apparently sealed by Inspector Slack's damning notebook entries. Moving with unhurried grace, Miss Marple approached the refreshment table where the evening's tragedy had unfolded. Her knitting bag swayed gently as she walked, and her expression carried nothing more threatening than mild curiosity about domestic arrangements. Yet there was something in her manner that commanded attention. "If we might reconstruct the scene as it was," she said, addressing the group with apologetic diffidence. "Sometimes the smallest details become clear only when we see them in their proper context." She gestured toward the table with its 2 sugar bowls, the bent silver tongs, and the coffee urn that had dispensed Inspector Slack's fatal refreshment. Mrs. Simcox, who had been maintaining her characteristic air of helpful concern throughout the evening's proceedings, stepped forward with practiced efficiency. "Of course, Miss Marple, though I cannot imagine what such an exercise might accomplish when the evidence is so clear." "Quite so, dear," Miss Marple replied with gentle persistence. "But humor an old woman's need to understand exactly how things occurred. Mrs. Simcox, you were so kind to fetch your grandmother's tongs when the vicarage ones went missing. Perhaps you might position them exactly as you did when you returned with them." The request seemed innocent enough. Yet something in Miss Marple's tone caused Mrs. Simcox to hesitate for just a moment before moving to comply. She placed the tongs between the 2 sugar bowls with brisk competence, their bent arm angling naturally toward the near right corner of the white sugar bowl designated for coffee service. "Thank you," Miss Marple murmured, studying the arrangement with apparent satisfaction. "Now, Doris dear, would you be so good as to demonstrate Inspector Slack's usual method? 2 cubes, always from his preferred position." Young Doris, still shaken by the evening's events, took the tongs with trembling hands. The bent arm guided her selection inexorably to the near right corner, exactly where the poisoned cubes had been waiting. The mechanical precision of the movement sent a visible shudder through the watching villagers. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then turned her attention to Inspector Slack's recovered notebook. Such a fortunate discovery, this notebook, though I confess myself puzzled by certain inconsistencies. She addressed Detective Inspector Craddock with the deferential manner of someone seeking clarification rather than offering criticism. "The leather shows remarkably little weathering for something that supposedly lay outdoors through last night's heavy dew. And the final entries, the ones that seem so conclusive regarding poor Lionel's guilt, appear to have been written with a different implement than the earlier passages." Inspector Slack was quite particular about using pencil for his field notes, yet these crucial observations are in ink. Mrs. Simcox's carefully maintained composure flickered almost imperceptibly. "Surely such technical details are best left to the experts, Miss Marple. We lay people can hardly be expected to understand forensic analysis." "Oh, quite right, dear," Miss Marple agreed with disarming mildness, "though I couldn't help noticing that the ink appears to be violet rather than the standard black." Such an unusual choice for official police notes. I recall you mentioning at the Women's Institute meeting that you preferred violet ink for your correspondence. So much more cheerful than ordinary black, you said. The effect of this seemingly innocent observation was immediate and telling. Mrs. Simcox's face went through a series of subtle changes: surprise, calculation, and finally a kind of cold assessment that revealed, for just a moment, the calculating mind beneath her facade of helpful concern. "I'm sure many people use violet ink," she replied, her voice carrying a note of defensive precision. "It's hardly evidence of anything sinister." Miss Marple continued with relentless gentleness. "Of course not, dear. Though it did remind me of another small detail: the cream-colored stationery used for those dreadful anonymous letters. Doris mentioned you had purchased a box of just such paper from the post office recently. For your diocesan board correspondence, I believe." Mrs. Simcox's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward her handbag, a gesture that Miss Marple noted with the same calm attention she might give to a sparrow's movement across a hedge. The woman was clearly assessing her situation, weighing whether her position remained salvageable or whether more drastic measures might be necessary. "You're suggesting something quite serious, Miss Marple," Mrs. Simcox said, her voice now stripped of its earlier pretense of helpful concern. "I hope you're prepared to substantiate such implications." The transformation was remarkable and chilling. The helpful, efficient woman who had spent years cultivating her reputation as a pillar of village society revealed herself as someone capable of cold-blooded calculation and ruthless self-preservation. Her expression hardened into something that spoke of genuine malice, and her posture shifted from deferential helpfulness to predatory assessment. "You're a very observant woman, Miss Marple," she said finally, abandoning all pretense of innocence. "Perhaps too observant for your own good." Miss Marple recognized this moment as the crucial juncture in any confrontation with a cornered criminal. Mrs. Simcox was no longer pretending innocence, but was instead evaluating her options for escape or elimination of the threat that Miss Marple's knowledge represented. Detective Inspector Craddock, observing Mrs. Simcox's dramatic transformation, felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with devastating clarity. The bent tongs, the forged notebook entries, the systematic anonymous letter campaign all pointed to a mind capable of meticulous planning and ruthless execution. "I think," he said quietly, his hand moving to his warrant book, "that we need to have a much longer conversation, Mrs. Simcox, and perhaps examine your home for additional evidence of your correspondence activities." The evening's final confrontation was about to begin, and Miss Marple prepared herself for what she suspected would be the most dangerous moments of an already perilous night. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead was about to witness the unmasking of a killer whose carefully constructed facade had hidden depths of malice that would shock those who had never looked beyond surface appearances to understand the darker truths that lay beneath. The psychological pressure that had been building around Mrs. Simcox reached its breaking point as Detective Inspector Craddock prepared to make his arrest. Her carefully maintained facade of helpful concern had cracked beyond repair, revealing glimpses of the calculating mind that had orchestrated Inspector Slack's murder with such methodical precision. Miss Marple moved closer to the refreshment table, her gentle manner unchanged despite the gravity of the moment. "Perhaps, Mrs. Simcox, you might help us understand exactly how the evening's arrangements came together. Your assistance has been so thorough throughout." The words carried no accusation, yet Mrs. Simcox's reaction was immediate and telling. Her hands, which had remained steady throughout the evening's chaos, now showed a barely perceptible tremor as she reached unconsciously toward her handbag, a gesture that Miss Marple noted with the same calm attention she might give to a bird's movement across a hedge. "The tongs, for instance," Miss Marple continued with characteristic mildness, lifting the bent silver implements. "Such beautiful pieces. Your grandmother's, you mentioned." though I couldn't help noticing the peculiar way they guide one's selection. She demonstrated gently, showing how the bent arm naturally directed the tongs toward the near right corner of the sugar bowl. Most convenient for someone who understood Inspector Slack's particular habits. Mrs. Simcox's composure flickered dangerously. Many people have predictable habits, Miss Marple. That hardly constitutes evidence of murder. Quite so, dear. Though combined with other small details. Miss Marple's voice trailed off as she examined Inspector Slack's recovered notebook. The violet ink troubled me, you see. Such an unusual choice for official police notes, and the paper quality, rather too fine for standard police issue. I recalled your mention at the Women's Institute meeting about preferring violet ink for correspondence. So much more cheerful than ordinary black, you said. The effect was devastating. Mrs. Simcox's carefully constructed mask of innocence began to dissolve, revealing something harder and more calculating beneath. You're suggesting I forged police evidence? That's a very serious accusation. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm as she continued her gentle interrogation. Not suggesting, dear, observing. The notebook entries describing Lionel's supposed guilt were written with remarkable insight into village dynamics, almost as if the author possessed intimate knowledge of everyone's secrets and vulnerabilities. Which brings us to the anonymous letters, Detective Inspector Craddock interjected, his professional instincts now fully engaged. A systematic campaign designed to create suspicion and discord, the sort of thing that requires patience, observation, and detailed knowledge of the community. Mrs. Simcox's transformation was complete now, her helpful efficiency replaced by cold assessment. You think you understand, but you know nothing about what it means to serve this village faithfully for years, only to be taken for granted like a useful piece of furniture. The bitterness in her voice was startling in its intensity. Years of accumulated resentment poured forth as she abandoned all pretense of innocence. I was the one who made everything work. Every successful fête, every smoothly run meeting, every crisis quietly resolved. My competence, my dedication, and yet who received recognition? Who was consulted when important decisions were made? Miss Marple listened with the compassionate attention of someone who understood that even the darkest crimes often grew from very human needs for recognition and respect. And when Inspector Slack began investigating the letters, he threatened to expose not just your campaign, but perhaps other irregularities from the past. He was going to destroy everything I'd built, Mrs. Simcox said with chilling matter-of-factness. My reputation, my position in this community, all because of his meddlesome investigation into matters that should have remained buried. Craddock stepped forward with quiet authority. Mrs. Simcox, I'm arresting you for the murder of Inspector Slack and for conducting a systematic campaign of malicious correspondence. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence. For a moment, Mrs. Simcox seemed to consider resistance, her hand moving toward her handbag with practiced efficiency. But the weight of evidence and the certainty of exposure had broken something essential in her carefully constructed world. The woman who had spent years manipulating others through anonymous letters and helpful efficiency found herself finally powerless to control her own fate. As Constable Pork moved to escort Mrs. Simcox away, Miss Marple reflected on the patterns of human nature that had led to this tragedy. The need for recognition and control, when twisted by years of perceived slights and unacknowledged service, had transformed a capable woman into something dangerous and destructive. Such a waste, she murmured to Dr. Haydock as they watched the proceedings. All that energy and intelligence, if only it had been directed toward building rather than destroying. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead had learned that evil could wear the most respectable faces, and that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful and trustworthy. The church clock continued its steady ticking, marking time as the investigation reached its inevitable conclusion, and the community began the difficult process of healing from betrayal by one of their own. The evening's revelations had exposed not just a murderer, but the complex web of human relationships that could transform service into resentment and helpfulness into malice. Miss Marple understood that while justice had been served, the psychological scars left by Mrs. Simcox's campaign of deception would take far longer to heal than the immediate shock of her exposure. The formal arrest of Mrs. Simcox brought a peculiar stillness to the vicarage garden, as if the very air itself was recovering from the shock of revelation. Detective Inspector Craddock completed his arrangements with professional efficiency, while the assembled villagers struggled to reconcile the helpful woman they thought they knew with the calculating killer who had been exposed in their midst. The festive bunting still hanging between the ancient yews seemed suddenly incongruous against the gravity of the evening's true conclusion. Miss Marple remained at her position near the refreshment table, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm as she addressed the lingering questions with characteristic gentleness. It was, you see, quite an elegant arrangement, she explained to the gathered company. Mrs. Simcox understood Inspector Slack's habits perfectly, his preference for coffee over tea, his methodical addition of exactly 2 sugar cubes, always selected from the same position in the bowl. She lifted the bent silver tongs, demonstrating their subtle but crucial modification. These beautiful family pieces were deliberately altered to guide selection to the near right corner, precisely where the poisoned cubes had been placed. The timing was perfect. Her brief absence to fetch the replacement tongs provided an alibi for the actual moment of poison placement, while her helpful return established her as a concerned participant rather than a suspicious actor. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. The cyanide was acquired under Lionel's Camera Club account, but by a veiled woman whose signature could be interpreted as either L or S. The forged notebook entries were perhaps the most chilling aspect, written in violet ink rather than Inspector Slack's usual pencil, creating a false narrative of Lionel's guilt that nearly convinced us all. Young Lionel Jerrold, released from the shadow of suspicion, sat pale and shaken beside his formidable aunt. Mrs. Jerrold's imperious manner had softened into something approaching gratitude, though her eyes still held the fierce protectiveness that had sustained her throughout the ordeal. "I should have told the inspector about the account discrepancies," Lionel said quietly. "I was afraid he would think me guilty of something worse." "Fear and guilt wear similar expressions in a young man," Miss Marple observed with gentle understanding. The village quite naturally mistook one for the other. The reactions of the other villagers followed predictable patterns of human nature when confronted with hidden evil in their midst. Colonel Hartnell, drawing upon his military experience, approached Lionel with a stiff bow that conveyed more eloquence than words. Mrs. Pierce, never one to miss dramatic developments, began the process of reinterpreting past interactions with Mrs. Simcox in light of her revealed character, though she managed to express something approaching contrition for her earlier suspicions of the innocent young man. Griselda, with the practical wisdom of a vicar's wife, began organizing the restoration of normalcy, clearing away the remnants of the fête that had been transformed from celebration into crime scene. Her movements carried the careful deliberation of someone understanding that physical order might help restore emotional equilibrium to a community shaken by betrayal. As Detective Inspector Craddock prepared to depart, he paused beside Miss Marple with professional respect. "Your intervention prevented a terrible miscarriage of justice. An innocent man would have faced the gallows while a calculating killer continued her campaign of manipulation." Miss Marple tucked her knitting away thoughtfully. "In my experience, Inspector, the most dangerous criminals are not those who act from passion or desperation, but those who possess the patience and intelligence to transform the very instruments of justice into weapons for their own protection." Mrs. Simcox spent years cultivating her reputation as a pillar of village society, using that trust as both shield and sword. The church clock chimed the early morning hours, its steady rhythm marking time as St. Mary Mead began the difficult process of healing from betrayal by one of their own. The peaceful village had learned that evil rarely announced itself with obvious malevolence, but instead wore respectable faces and employed trusted methods using society's own mechanisms of cooperation as weapons for personal advancement and revenge. Miss Marple reflected on the patterns of human nature that had led to this tragedy, the need for recognition and control that, when twisted by years of perceived slights and unacknowledged service, had transformed legitimate grievances into something dangerous and destructive. The anonymous letters had been merely the opening gambit in a sophisticated campaign that culminated in murder and the near destruction of an innocent young man's life. As dawn approached and the villagers began to disperse, Miss Marple remained in the garden, watching the last of the official proceedings with the calm attention that had served her so well throughout the investigation. The bunting still sagged with more than evening dew, and she understood that while the physical evidence would be cleared away, the psychological impact would linger far longer. Human nature, she mused, remained remarkably consistent in its capacity for both great evil and unexpected resilience. The village would heal, trust would gradually return, and life would resume its familiar rhythms, though perhaps with a deeper understanding of the fragile peace that governed their daily existence. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed over deception, and that, she reflected with quiet satisfaction, was what mattered most in the end. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead settled into the approaching dawn, forever changed but not broken, carrying forward the eternal lesson that vigilance and compassion must walk hand in hand if communities are to survive the darkness that sometimes emerges from within their own trusted circles. The morning light that filtered through the vicarage windows brought with it the peculiar clarity that follows any great revelation, transforming the scene of the previous evening's drama into something approaching normalcy. Miss Marple remained in the garden as the official proceedings concluded, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm while Detective Inspector Craddock completed his final arrangements with characteristic thoroughness. Mrs. Simcox's departure in the police car had left behind a silence more profound than any that had fallen during the night's unfolding drama. The quiet shock of a community discovering that evil had worn such a familiar, helpful face. The bunting, now limp in the morning air, seemed to mock the celebration that had been so thoroughly transformed by murder and deception. Craddock's telephone call an hour later confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected about the systematic nature of Mrs. Simcox's campaign. The search of her cottage had revealed a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. The cream-colored stationery with its distinctive watermark, bottles of violet ink, a collection of parish membership lists annotated with personal observations, and most tellingly, a blotter whose ghostly impressions revealed drafts of several anonymous letters, various stages of composition. She had been planning this for months, Craddock reported to the assembled group in Griselda's sitting room. The notebook entries were prepared weeks in advance, written on paper she had stolen from the police station during a village council meeting. Even the bent tongs were modified specifically for their intended purpose. We found the pliers she used, still bearing traces of silver. Dr. Haydock shook his head in professional amazement. The psychological profile that emerges is extraordinary. She possessed the patience to observe Inspector Slack's habits over multiple visits, the chemical knowledge to prepare the poison safely, and the emotional coldness to watch an innocent man nearly destroyed by her deception. Young Lionel Jerrold, accompanied by his formidable aunt, bore the somewhat dazed expression of someone emerging from a nightmare into uncertain daylight. His gratitude toward Miss Marple was profound, but quiet, carrying the weight of someone who had glimpsed the abyss of false accusation and emerged grateful for the intervention of wisdom and patience. "I wanted to thank you properly, Miss Marple," he said, his voice still carrying traces of the shock that had nearly destroyed him. "Your faith in my innocence meant more than I can express." Mrs. Jerrold, displaying an emotional vulnerability rarely seen in her public persona, added her own appreciation. The systematic destruction of my nephew's reputation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Mrs. Simcox's campaign. She understood exactly how to exploit our community's natural tendencies toward suspicion and gossip. The other villagers processed the revelation according to their natures. Mrs. Pierce, unusually subdued, admitted to feeling quite taken in by that woman's helpful manner, while Colonel Hartnell declared with military precision that one must learn to distinguish between genuine service and manipulative positioning. Even Griselda, ever practical, moved with new caution as she supervised the final clearing of the refreshment tables. As the morning progressed and the immediate participants began to disperse, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the patterns of human nature that had led to this tragedy. "There is a particular type of person," she observed to Dr. Haydock, "to whom efficiency becomes a form of power and helpfulness a method of control. When their contributions go unrecognized, resentment can transform legitimate grievances into something quite dangerous." The psychological profile that had emerged troubled her deeply. Mrs. Simcox had represented the most insidious type of criminal, one who used society's own mechanisms of trust and cooperation as weapons for personal advancement and revenge. The anonymous letters had been merely the opening gambit in a sophisticated campaign that culminated in murder and the near destruction of an innocent man's reputation. She possessed what one might call administrative evil, Miss Marple continued thoughtfully. The ability to organize destruction with the same methodical precision others bring to charitable works. Her need for recognition, when thwarted, became a need to punish those who had failed to appreciate her contributions adequately. As the church clock chimed the noon hour, its first chime since the previous evening's tragedy, Miss Marple prepared to return to her cottage. The village would heal, she understood, though trust would require time and patience to rebuild. The bonds that held communities like St. Mary Mead together were stronger than the malice of any individual, however cleverly disguised or systematically applied. The ancient yews stood unchanged, their branches now free of decorative bunting, but still offering the same peaceful shade that had sheltered countless village gatherings over the centuries. The garden had been restored to its familiar tranquility, though it would forever carry the memory of Inspector Slack's final moments and the revelation of Mrs. Simcox's carefully constructed deception. Walking slowly toward her cottage gate, Miss Marple reflected on the eternal lesson that had once again revealed itself, that evil could indeed wear the most respectable faces and employ the most trusted methods, but that truth possessed its own persistent quality that eventually emerged, despite the most sophisticated attempts at concealment. Justice had been served, an innocent man had been saved from destruction, and the delicate balance between civilization and chaos that made peaceful village life possible had been preserved through careful observation and patient understanding of the patterns that governed human nature in all its complexity. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead settled into the advancing day, forever changed but not broken, carrying forward the knowledge that vigilance and compassion must walk hand in hand if communities are to survive the darkness that sometimes emerges from within their own most trusted circles.